Rachel Adams had always lived a quiet life in the rolling hills of Vermont, where the air smelled of pine and maple and the seasons painted her world with the brushstrokes of God himself. At 45, she was a devoted mother of 2 teenage children, a loving wife, and a respected art teacher at the local high school. Her days were spent in the rhythm of family school projects and the joy of watching young artists find their voice through color and canvas. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, but her life was full in the ways that mattered. Yet Rachel often carried within her a quiet sense of otherness. Since childhood, she had seen things in dreams, vivid places, and people she couldn't explain. And sometimes when she walked into a room, she could sense what someone was feeling before a word was spoken. She had long dismissed it as an overactive imagination, or simply the intuitive sensitivity of a teacher and a mother. But everything changed on a cold afternoon in November, when her life unraveled in a moment that no one saw coming. It was the day after her school's fall art exhibit, a vibrant display of student paintings that Rachel had lovingly curated. The sun was beginning to set, casting long amber streaks across the classroom as she tidied up leftover paintbrushes and drying easels. As she bent down to pick up a stack of papers, a sharp, blinding pain shot through the back of her head. The world spun violently. She clutched her skull, staggered, and collapsed to the floor. Rachel had suffered a ruptured brain aneurysm, a condition so deadly that many do not make it to the hospital alive. Within minutes, paramedics rushed her to the nearest ER, and as she slipped into unconsciousness, her heart flatlined for over 3 minutes during emergency surgery. But what happened next was not darkness. Rachel's first sensation was not pain, but peace. She later described it as if her body had been wrapped in warm light, like lying on a quiet beach in late spring, while the sun rested gently on her skin. She realized she was no longer in her body. She could see the surgeons working feverishly, see her husband pacing in the waiting room, holding their daughter's trembling hand. But at the same time, she was elsewhere, somewhere more real than anything she had ever known. She found herself standing barefoot in what she could only call a living garden. The grass was soft beneath her feet, almost humming with energy. Flowers bloomed in colors she couldn't name, and the air shimmered with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was peaceful, yes, but also familiar, like returning to a home she had never known she missed. There were no words spoken in that place, but thoughts were understood instantly. Emotions passed between souls like shared music. Rachel encountered 3 beings in the garden, her spirit guides, though she didn't need to be told who they were. 2 looked like people she had seen in dreams, a tall woman with silver hair and eyes like the sea, and a younger man whose laughter she somehow recognized as a childhood comfort. The third didn't have a human face at all, but radiated a presence so strong, so all-knowing, that Rachel named him Peter, even though she instinctively knew that wasn't his true name. These guides didn't speak aloud. They simply made her understand. They welcomed her, surrounded her in love, and helped her see her life, not just the life she had lived, but the lives she had lived before. Rachel saw herself in a dozen different forms: a healer in a coastal village centuries ago, a mother in ancient times fleeing war, a young girl tending gardens in a monastery. She saw joy and sorrow, betrayal and forgiveness, laughter and loss woven together into a radiant tapestry of purpose. Each lifetime was not separate, but a thread in a greater story, teaching her compassion, resilience, and love. And now she was being given a choice. The guides showed her what would happen if she stayed. Peace, healing, reunion. But they also showed her what would happen if she returned: 18 months of pain, struggle, and despair, both physical and emotional. If she chose to live, she would have to fight harder than she ever had. She would lose her speech, her mobility, her independence. But if she endured, she would help others. She would paint what she saw. She would speak of the truth beyond the veil. She would become a light in the dark for those who felt forgotten. Rachel hesitated. She felt so at home there. But then in the distance of that timeless realm, she saw her daughter crying alone in the hospital hallway. She saw her son gripping a teddy bear he had long outgrown, and she knew she had to go back, not because she was afraid of death, but because she could not bear to let her children suffer without her. She made the choice without words, but heaven understood. In the blink of an eye, the warmth of that radiant garden faded, and she was back in a hospital bed, tubes down her throat, unable to move or speak. The fight had begun. But Rachel would carry something with her that no stroke, no injury, no human diagnosis could take away: the memory of a place where love was the only language, and where every soul, no matter how broken, was eternally known. The return to her body was not a soft landing. Rachel Adams re-entered this world like a bird colliding with glass, shocked, disoriented, and imprisoned in flesh that no longer felt like her own. The light and love of that divine garden still pulsed faintly in her memory, but now it was muffled beneath a harsh hospital glow. 4 lines and the persistent beeping of machines. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Her right side was paralyzed. Her vision was distorted, and for a while she was completely blind in one eye. The vibrant teacher who once skipped down art room hallways in paint-stained jeans had become in a matter of moments a fragile figure in a hospital gown, hooked up, helpless, silent. But while her body lay still, her spirit refused to surrender. Deep within, Rachel remembered the promise made in that otherworldly field that the path ahead would be brutal, yes, but also meaningful, that everything broken could somehow become beautiful again. On the outside, she was motionless, but on the inside, she was already preparing for battle. The first few days in the neuro ICU were blurred with morphine confusion and emotional chaos. Doctors didn't expect her to recover much, maybe a few facial twitches, a word or two if they were lucky. Her husband Mark sat by her bedside for hours, whispering to her even when there was no response. Her children Emma and Caleb were only allowed short visits, and their frightened eyes cut deeper than any scalpel. One of the nurses, moved by the sorrow and stillness in the room, suggested something odd. "Sing to her," she said. "Sometimes stroke patients can sing before they can talk." So on Christmas morning, with snow falling outside the ICU window and tubes still down her throat, Mark sang Silent Night through trembling lips. And from somewhere deep inside, Rachel hummed along. It was the first crack in the stone wall. Small, soft, but undeniable. By the end of that week, Rachel could blink to communicate yes and no. Within 10 days, she uttered her first word, home. It didn't come out smoothly. Her voice was broken, robotic, almost childlike. But it was hers. Nurses cried. Her husband clutched her hand like it was made of gold. And Rachel, she wept too, not just from gratitude, but from the overwhelming weight of reality. She was back, but the road ahead was long and steep. Rehabilitation began painfully slow. Her right hand dangled like dead weight. Her leg dragged like it had forgotten how to belong to her. Her speech was slurred, her memory patchy, and she was too weak to eat without a feeding tube. Still, she kept going. Every day she faced an endless cycle of physical therapy, speech therapy, and occupational drills that felt more like cruel repetition than hope. But as her muscles strained and her voice faltered, she clung to the truth. She had chosen this. This pain, this crawl toward restoration. It wasn't punishment. It was part of her purpose. There were dark days, of course. Days when she sobbed quietly into her pillow, feeling more burden than blessing. Nights when her mind, still chemically imbalanced from seizure medication, whispered dangerous thoughts. Her neurologist warned her husband that many stroke patients suffer post-traumatic depression. But Rachel was open about it. She told her doctors. She asked for help. She surrounded herself with people who reminded her, "You are still Rachel. You are still here." 3 months in, she had regained enough control to walk with a cane and speak in full, if halting sentences. One afternoon, while flipping through old sketchbooks to reawaken her artistic muscles, her spirit guides those same loving presences from her NDE, nudged her gently in the chest. "Paint," they said. "Paint what you saw." At first, Rachel resisted. Her fingers were stiff, her fine motor skills clumsy. But one morning, she sat down in front of a blank canvas and began to paint. The first brushstroke was shaky, the second a little smoother. By the time she reached the 10th, she was sobbing not from frustration, but because it was coming back. Not just her technique, but the vision, the meadow, the flowers, the pond that glowed with living light. She painted from memory not of this world, but of the world beyond. When her first painting was finished, her family stared in silence. "It looks like heaven," her daughter whispered. Rachel nodded. It was. From that moment, art became her language of healing. Painting was not only therapy for her brain, it was a way to express what words couldn't contain. As her body grew stronger, her spirit soared higher. Friends began asking her to share her story. At first she was shy, afraid of being judged, labeled, dismissed. But each time she spoke about the garden, the guides, and the choice she made to come back, people cried. They felt less alone. They remembered their own loved ones, or their own brushes, with the mysterious. And they asked the same thing again and again. How did you come back? Rachel never had a clinical answer. The doctors said it was a statistical fluke, a miracle. But Rachel believed differently. I didn't just come back, she'd tell them gently. I was sent back with a mission. As spring bloomed outside her Vermont home, so too did Rachel's new life. Her walk was still uneven, her words still sometimes tangled, but she had returned with something far greater than physical strength. She had returned with clarity. And that clarity began to guide everything she did, how she spoke to strangers, how she comforted the grieving, how she taught her children to look at the world, not with fear, but with wonder. She was not the same woman who had collapsed on that cold November afternoon. She was something more, something deeper, something reborn. It was the quiet moments that challenged Rachel Adams the most. Not the hospital days filled with tests or the grueling therapy sessions where every movement felt like a war against gravity, but the stillness. The hours at home when the sun would cast long shadows on the hardwood floors, and silence would settle over the house like a heavy fog. It was in those in-between spaces, between life and memory, between the old self and the new, that Rachel wrestled with what her return from the other side truly meant. She had made the choice to come back. She had faced the brutal reality of recovery inch by inch. But now, with her body slowly healing and her mind regaining clarity, she found herself standing at the edge of another mountain, the question of why. Rachel was not the woman she had been before the aneurysm. She knew that. She felt it in her bones, in her breath, in the way her heart responded to the world around her. The old Rachel had been grounded in the tangible family work duty. But this Rachel carried memories of a garden not found on earth, voices that spoke without sound, and an understanding that souls were older than time. That knowledge didn't fade with her healing, it deepened. It followed her into grocery stores, family dinners, and quiet walks through Vermont's winding forest trails. It pressed against her chest in the night and whispered, "You're not done yet." The art had become her voice when words failed her. After her first painting of the garden, glowing reeds surrounding a pond that shimmered like liquid gold, she began to receive messages from people all over town. Friends, Strangers, even former students, reached out to say her work made them feel something they couldn't describe. Some said they cried without knowing why. Others said it reminded them of dreams they'd long forgotten. "It feels like home," one woman told her after a local exhibit. Rachel smiled. "That's exactly what it was," she said gently. Home. But art wasn't the end of her calling, it was only the beginning. Rachel began journaling each morning, not out of habit but from a deep urge to capture the fragments she still remembered from her time beyond. Sometimes it came out as poetry, sometimes as story, sometimes even as direct conversation with her spirit guides, Gail Jonah, the new name she gave the man once called Peter, and Elia. They were never far. Since the day she first painted, their presence had become a quiet comfort in her daily life. Not loud, not flashy, but constant, like a lighthouse in the distance when fog rolls in. They urged her lovingly but persistently to speak, to share, to tell her story not just through images, but with her voice. "People are hungry," Elia told her one morning as she sat in her small studio watching the snow fall just beyond the windows. "They're walking around hollow, trying to remember what they've forgotten." "You've seen what they've forgotten, Rachel. Remind them." But the fear was real. Not fear of death, she had made peace with that long ago, but fear of ridicule. Fear of being misunderstood. After all, she was just a small-town teacher, a mother, a wife. Who would believe that she had stood in a garden between dimensions, that she had seen herself in past lives and chosen to come back, because her children weren't ready to lose her? What if they thought she was crazy? And yet each time she hesitated, life responded. Someone would mention a dream that shook them. A widow would tell her about feeling her husband's presence after he passed. A teenager would ask her out of nowhere if she believed people had lived before. And each time Rachel would feel that nudge inside her, a divine push to say more, to go deeper. Not to convince anyone, but to simply bear witness. So she started small. She accepted an invitation to speak at a women's prayer group at the local Methodist church, even though she herself no longer felt confined by any one denomination. She stood before 30 women, her voice still carrying the hesitation of someone freshly awakened, but her heart full. She didn't read a script. She spoke from memory, from presence. And for the first time she shared the story of the garden, of the choice, of her return. The room was silent when she finished, not because of disbelief, but because every woman there had touched in her own way a piece of what Rachel described. One had held her mother's hand as she passed, and felt a warmth fill the room. Another remembered floating above her body during surgery at 20. A third wept silently, saying she had always felt different, and wondered if perhaps, like Rachel, she had once remembered too much. That night, something broke. Open. Rachel received 6 more invitations within the week from senior centers, grief groups, and even a regional hospital's spiritual care team. Each time she said yes. Each time her story reached a new soul. And each time she remembered the words of Gail. "This won't be easy, but it will be sacred." She began recording her dreams again now, often vivid and laden with symbols. In one, she stood before a vast river where people were lining up waiting to cross. Some were afraid, others calm. But in the dream, Rachel simply opened her arms and they walked through her light to the other side. When she asked her guides what it meant, Jonah answered with a smile in her heart. "You are a bridge now." Being a bridge wasn't without its weight. Rachel still struggled with fatigue. Her speech, while mostly recovered, would still slur if she was tired. She couldn't drive long distances without headaches. Some nights she cried from the frustration of a body that still bore scars, but each challenge became part of her testimony. A living proof that suffering and grace could coexist. That strength wasn't always in perfection, but in persistence. One evening, as Rachel sat beside a crackling fire, her daughter Emma came and curled up next to her. "Mom," she whispered, "do you ever miss it?" That place. Rachel looked into the flames for a long moment. "Every day," she said softly, but not in a sad way. "It's like knowing there's a warm light waiting at the end of a long road, and knowing that until then, I still have work to do here." Emma didn't respond. She just rested her head on her mother's shoulder, the way she did as a child, and they watched the fire flicker, two souls held quietly in a moment where heaven and earth weren't so far apart after all. The further Rachel Adams walked from the sterile hospital room where she'd first opened her eyes post-surgery, the closer she drew to the sacred weight of the vow she had made on the other side. Though her body had begun to mend, albeit imperfectly, the transformation within her spirit moved at a different pace. Slower in some ways, deeper in others. It was no longer just about recovering from a stroke or painting heavenly visions on canvas. No, this part of the journey was about integration. About learning how to live between two realities, the physical one she could touch, and the eternal one she had glimpsed, but could never fully explain. What surprised Rachel most was not how deeply her story touched others. It was how hungry people were to hear it. At first, she had thought her audience would be limited to the spiritual or the grieving. But she found herself sharing her near-death experience with engineers, librarians, truck drivers, retired nurses, veterans, farmers, even skeptics who came out of sheer curiosity but left with tears in their eyes. They weren't drawn to her because she was a teacher or a painter. They came because they sensed truth wrapped not in dogma or doctrine, but in lived experience, in quiet reverence, in the way she spoke of heaven as a place not far above the clouds, but within reach, closer than breath. And as word spread, invitations rolled in faster than she ever expected. She was asked to speak at a senior community center in Burlington, where one elderly man, a Korean War veteran, stood up at the end of her talk and said, "I saw that light too back in '53 when I thought I was dying in a trench. But no one ever believed me. Thank you for reminding me I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone." Another time, at a small Unitarian church in Montpellier, a widow approached her with trembling hands holding a photo of her late husband. "Do you think he's there?" the woman asked. Rachel simply nodded, eyes misting. "If he loved you and you loved him, then yes. Love always leads us home." Yet for all the public resonance her story received, Rachel struggled with the private weight of what she now carried. The more she spoke about what she saw, the garden beyond time, the spirit guides, the lifetimes stitched into her soul, the more she realized she could no longer pretend to be the person she was before. It wasn't that she no longer loved the people or routines of her past. She did, deeply, but she no longer fit in the same skin. Birthday parties, grocery store chit-chat, even PTA meetings sometimes felt like echoes of a life she had outgrown. And this realization, though natural, brought grief. Some friends drifted away, not unkindly, but with a sort of puzzled distance. They didn't understand why Rachel had changed, why she spoke more about soul growth than meal planning, why she wept during sunsets or sat in silence for long periods during coffee dates. Others admired her from afar, sharing her posts, but avoiding direct conversation. Even her own husband, Mark, who had been her rock during the darkest nights, sometimes looked at her with a quiet unease, as if wondering whether the woman who returned from the brink was truly the same one he had married 2 decades ago. And perhaps she wasn't. Rachel didn't blame him. In fact, she understood him more deeply now than she ever had before. She could feel his fear, not of losing her, but of no longer knowing her. So one night, as they sat in their backyard under a Vermont sky stitched with stars, she took his hand and said, "I'm still me. Just a version of me that's seen a little more light." He looked at her for a long time, then pulled her hand to his chest. "I never stopped loving you," he whispered. "But sometimes I don't know how to reach you." She placed her other hand over his heart. "Then meet me here," she said softly. "Not in what we say, but in what we feel." That moment didn't fix everything, but it planted something new. From that point forward, Mark tried to walk with her, not always understanding, but always present. He attended her talks when he could. He helped carry her easels and paintings into churches and community halls, and most importantly, he listened, not just with ears, but with his whole being. Rachel's spiritual sensitivity, once something she hid as a child, began blossoming in daily life. She would wake in the middle of the night with a sense that someone somewhere needed prayer. She'd light a candle and sit in silence, and sometimes a name would come to her, a neighbor, a stranger from one of her talks, a child she had taught years ago. These moments became part of her rhythm, not something she advertised, but something sacred, tucked between breakfast and bills, between walking the dog and folding laundry. Her guides remained with her too, not always speaking, but present in the texture of her thoughts, in the intuitive nudges she had learned to trust. Sometimes when she was painting, she could feel Gail behind her, strong and maternal. Other times it was Jonah's calm steadiness, reminding her to rest when she pushed herself too hard. And Elia, elusive but radiant, often appeared in dreams, reminding her of the bigger picture. "You're not just healing from a stroke," he once said. "You're healing generations of fear. Every act of courage you take sends ripples through the field of consciousness. Keep going." One of the most profound shifts Rachel experienced was in how she viewed time and connection. She no longer saw people as separate or encounters as random. Every conversation, every meeting, even every argument was part of a woven fabric she hadn't seen before. She began to speak gently to strangers, even when rushed. She began leaving small notes in library books and writing prayers in the margins of her journal for people she'd never meet. "We're all walking each other home," she'd written on a sticky note left inside a copy of Tuesdays with Maury. Despite her ongoing physical limitations, her right hand still weaker than the left, her speech occasionally garbled under stress, Rachel now lived with a clarity and conviction that far outweighed any lingering pain. She wasn't perfect. She didn't pretend to be. But she had purpose now, and that gave her strength. A strength born not from willpower, but from surrender. Not from certainty, but from trust. As autumn returned to Vermont with its fire-colored trees and crisp air, Rachel hosted her first solo art exhibit since her aneurysm. It was titled "The Garden and the Path." The paintings, abstract but radiant, drew dozens of guests. But it was her short, handwritten introduction displayed at the door that stopped people in their tracks. It read, "I died. I came back. But not as the same woman. I walked through light, met the timeless version of myself, and saw how each of us is both a seed and a star, small and infinite all at once. These paintings are glimpses of the world behind the veil. I hope they remind you of who you really are." The deeper Rachel Adams moved into her new life, the more she began to notice something remarkable. Time no longer moved the way it used to. Not that the clock stopped ticking or that calendars no longer held meaning, but rather that time, at least, in the way she once understood it, felt softer now, more flexible, less like a taskmaster and more like a companion. Before her aneurysm, life had always been measured by lists and deadlines, school semesters, dinner preparations, bills to pay, appointments to keep. But after her return from the garden, from that place beyond breath and bone, Rachel no longer felt trapped inside the march of time. She had come to realize what her spirit guides had whispered from the beginning, that moments were sacred and presence, true presence, was the only way to live fully awake. It changed how she moved through her days. She found herself pausing more often to feel the breeze against her face, to watch the way morning light played on the kitchen floor, to truly listen when someone spoke. She began writing this word "be" on small, sticky notes, placing them inside books, wallets, and even on her dashboard. It wasn't about slowing down for the sake of it. It was about learning to notice the sacred in the ordinary. She'd smile when someone called her different. She knew what they meant. She was different. How could she not be after seeing the eternal side of things? But with that softening of time came something harder, a sharpening of responsibility. Rachel knew her experience hadn't been just for her. The garden, the spirit guides, the knowing that she was part of a greater thread woven through countless lifetimes. It had all been given as both a gift and a charge. She was not meant to hoard what she had seen, nor to retreat into the safe cocoon of private healing. She was here for something larger. Her art had opened the first doorway. Her talks, the hesitant, heartfelt ones at churches, senior centers, and grief groups, had cracked open many more. But it was one afternoon in early spring, as she walked through a small cemetery near her childhood home, that the next chapter revealed itself. She stood before the grave of her former art mentor, a gentle woman named Mrs. Whitaker, who had passed when Rachel was in college. Rachel hadn't visited the grave in years, but now something pulled her there. As she traced the engraving on the headstone, she felt a sudden heat rise in her chest, not unpleasant, but commanding. And then, as clearly as if someone were standing beside her, she heard the words, "Teach them to remember." At first, she wasn't sure what it meant. Teach who remember what? But in the weeks that followed, the message became clearer. People began reaching out to her, not just to hear her story, but to share their own strange dreams, their unexplainable feelings, their quiet awakenings. They weren't looking for a sermon. They were seeking a space where they could speak without judgment. And Rachel knew this was the call. She was to become not just a witness of the afterlife, but a midwife for spiritual remembering. So she started something small, something she called the Remembering Circle. It was held once a month in the sunroom of her modest Vermont home. Just 8 chairs, a few candles, a kettle of herbal tea, and a small table with a single flickering lamp. The rules were simple. No one had to speak, but everyone was free to. There were no labels, no hierarchy, just souls remembering together. One by one, people came: an 82-year-old widower who felt his wife in the room every night, a young mother who kept dreaming of her grandfather's farm, a retired librarian who confessed she'd seen colors around people her entire life, but had been too afraid to tell anyone. Rachel didn't claim to have answers. She didn't try to interpret or explain. She simply held the space. And in doing so, people remembered that they too were more than flesh and fear, that they weren't broken, that they hadn't imagined the signs and the synchronicities, and most importantly, that they were not alone. Word spread quietly but steadily. Before long, people began traveling from out of state to attend her gatherings. A couple drove from upstate New York after reading her story in a community newsletter. A woman from Maine who had lost her son to suicide came and cried in silence for a full hour. When the group ended, she simply whispered, "Thank you for giving me a place to grieve with God." Rachel placed a hand on hers and said, "He was with you then. He's with you now. Love never lets go." With each gathering, Rachel noticed something stirring within her. Not ego, never that, but a growing sense of alignment, as if her soul were finally sitting in the right chair, after years of standing in the wrong room. She was still healing physically, still navigating the unpredictable tides of fatigue and brain fog. But she no longer felt fractured. The Rachel who stood in her sunroom each month was whole, not because she was pain-free, but because she was purpose-filled. Of course, there were still challenges. On certain days, her right hand trembled too much to hold a brush. On others, she'd forget simple words mid-sentence and flush with embarrassment. But she had made peace with her limitations. She no longer apologized for them. "This is my pace now," she'd say kindly when someone asked why she paused before responding. "It gives me time to hear the quiet things." And in those quiet things, she found treasures. One morning, while journaling near her window, she received what she called a soul letter from her guide, Gail. She often described these as thoughts that weren't hers, but arrived as full, compassionate messages. The letter said, "Do not measure your worth by how much you do, but by how much you remember who you are while doing it. Even if all you do today is sit and breathe and bless the sky, you have shaped the unseen world in ways you'll never fully know." She copied that message and taped it to her bathroom mirror. As summer approached, Rachel was invited to speak at a national gathering of near-death experiencers in Asheville, North Carolina. The idea of flying across the country, standing before hundreds of people and sharing her story on a larger stage once would have terrified her. But now she saw it not as a performance, but as a continuation of the garden, a living extension of the light she had touched. She accepted the invitation with peace in her heart, and her guides at her side. The night before her departure, she stood outside under the stars, the same stars that had watched her cry in pain, pray for strength, and rediscover wonder. Her husband stepped beside her, their fingers interlaced. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked upward and smiled. "I think I've been getting ready my whole life." The journey to the other side had changed Rachel Adams forever, but it was the journey back that refined her. The shimmering memories of the garden, the spirit guides, and the decision to return had never left her. Yet over time, something even deeper began to take root within her, a transformation not of knowledge, but of essence. She didn't simply believe in eternity anymore. She had tasted it. And because of that, she now lived each day, not as a ticking clock, but as a sacred assignment. She had said yes to life, yes to the pain of recovery, and yes to the unknowns of her calling. But what no one had prepared her for was how sacrificial that yes would become. It wasn't dramatic. Rachel didn't wear robes or call herself a prophet. She still shopped at the local co-op, still taught art lessons in her garage, still baked banana bread on cold mornings. But everything she touched carried a new weight. Even the mundane had become holy. She felt people before they spoke. She knew when someone was hurting just by the way they entered a room. Sometimes she'd sense the presence of their loved ones walking beside them, soft, unseen but radiant, and her heart would ache with a tenderness she couldn't explain. And with each encounter she was reminded this is what she came back for, not to dazzle but to discern, to comfort, and to lift quietly the veil between heaven and earth. But there was a cost to this kind of seeing. It was lonely at times. Not because she lacked love, her husband Mark remained a faithful companion, her children growing into compassionate young adults, but because the deeper she traveled into her own soul, the fewer people could truly walk with her there. Even when surrounded, she often felt like she stood in a silent chapel that others couldn't quite hear. She longed for peers who spoke the language of eternity fluently, who had also touched the edge of heaven and returned with dirt still under their fingernails. She met a few along the way, fellow near-death experiencers, hospice workers, A Vietnam veteran who saw angels on the battlefield, but they were rare and often scattered across states and time zones. So most days it was just her and God, and the whisper of her guides. Rachel began to sense that she had entered a new phase of calling, not louder but deeper. She had shared her testimony far and wide. She had painted the garden, written the dreams, spoken to crowds. Now her spirit began to draw her into something quieter and more personal: intercession. Not the kind preached about on Sunday morning, but the kind done in the dark. The kind that happens when the world is asleep, when souls are drifting between fear and forgetting, and someone somewhere must hold the line. It began with waking in the night. At first, sporadic, then regular. 2:17 a.m., 3:03, 4:11. Always the same heaviness in her chest, a knowing that someone somewhere needed covering. She would light a candle, wrap herself in the old quilt her grandmother made, and sit by the window. No words, just breath, just presence. Sometimes she'd whisper names. Sometimes she'd weep for strangers she would never meet. But she knew something was shifting in the unseen, and she had been assigned to it. The more she obeyed these nudges, the more attuned she became. Rachel started sensing when a neighbor's marriage was unraveling, when a woman in her art class was battling despair, when a friend's child was silently questioning the purpose of life. She never intruded. She never imposed. But she began leaving small notes in mailboxes, books, and pockets. You are not forgotten. You are loved beyond measure. She called them seeds, and she trusted that God would do the watering. One day she stood behind an older man at the post office. He looked worn, like time had eroded, not just his posture but his hope. As she watched him fumble for change, her heart began to ache. A soft whisper pressed against her. Tell him he's seen. Her rational mind recoiled. How would he respond? Would it embarrass him? But the nudge persisted. So she gently stepped forward and said, I don't know why I feel this, but you need to know that you are not invisible. You are deeply seen and very loved. His eyes welled up. I lost my wife 3 weeks ago, he whispered. No one has said my name out loud in days. Rachel walked out of that post office in tears. Not out of sadness, but because in that moment she understood the true nature of her mission: to live as a window clear enough that the light from the other side could shine through. She had begun writing again, though she didn't call it a book. She called it a collection of remembrances, short reflections, letters to God, and soul nudges that had stirred her in the early morning hours. One page simply read, The veil is thinner than we think. Sometimes it's not a veil at all, just fear dressed up as reason. Another entry said, To love is to be used by eternity without needing credit. Some of the greatest miracles never make headlines. They sit quietly at someone's kitchen table. The idea of publishing had been offered before, but she resisted any sense of fame. She wasn't looking to build a brand. She just wanted to bear witness to the reality of the unseen, to testify not as an expert, but as one beggar showing another where she had found bread. Meanwhile, her dreams had grown richer. No longer just visits to the garden, but symbolic journeys through doorways, rivers, bridges, and stairs that led nowhere yet meant everything. In one dream, she walked through a hospital filled with people asleep in their beds while soft bells chimed in the background. They're not sick, her guide Jonah told her. They're just forgetting. Sing to them. She awoke sobbing. So Rachel began to hum more when she painted, when she prayed, when she cooked. She believed sound could reach the soul in ways words could not. Sometimes when she held someone's hand in the remembering circle, she would quietly hum a note until their breathing softened. Healing didn't have to look like fire and wind, she'd learned. Sometimes it looked like stillness. Sometimes like a woman holding space for another without saying a single word. By the end of that year, Rachel no longer felt the need to explain herself to anyone. She didn't try to defend the garden or prove that her spirit guides were real, or convince anyone of past lives or divine assignments. She had moved beyond that. Her life itself had become the message. How she listened, how she loved, how she noticed, how she gave. These were now her testimonies. And so, on an ordinary Wednesday in October, as orange leaves fell gently outside her front porch, Rachel lit her morning candle, sat in her worn rocking chair, and whispered a simple prayer. Let me be a safe place today. Let me be a reminder. Let me be the bridge between forgetting and remembering. And somewhere across time, a soul stirred. A light flickered, a heart softened, and the garden whispered back, "You already are." The transformation of Rachel Adams was never meant to be loud. It wasn't marked by stages or applause or grand declarations. No headlines, no spotlight. And yet by the time the third anniversary of her near-death experience quietly passed, something remarkable had occurred. Her entire life had become the sermon. Every conversation she held, every painting she completed, every moment of deep listening in a grocery store line or quiet humming at the bedside of a grieving friend, it all became part of a divine echo. Not because she tried to be spiritual, but because she lived from a place beyond trying. Rachel no longer searched for what comes next. That old human itch, the need to know the plan, control the outcome, or chase success, had long since dissolved. The garden had given her that clarity. The purpose is presence, not performance. Her work was not to change the world in the way society measured it, but to love faithfully the corner of the world she'd been given. Her Vermont home, her community, her family. The strangers God sent across her path in divine disguise. Even the walls of her house bore witness to the shift. Her studio, once a place of artistic ambition, had become a sanctuary of remembrance. Canvases leaned against furniture not yet sold, each painted not to impress, but to translate the beauty of the beyond into color. Swirling indigos, soft bursts of gold, translucent brushstrokes of light. She painted not from reference but from memory, the memory of heaven. And while she still hosted the occasional gallery showing, she stopped marketing her work entirely. Let the right soul find it, she would say, trusting that the divine did not require promotion. Her family, too, had found their rhythm inside the mystery. Mark no longer tried to understand everything she sensed, he simply honored it. Their marriage had deepened through honesty and space, held together by the quiet agreement that love didn't need explanation to be real. Emma, now in college, sometimes called her mom the calmest lighthouse I know. Caleb, just out of high school, admitted one day that he had started meditating in the mornings using one of his mom's voice recordings as a guide. "You don't talk at me," he said. "You talk like you're remembering something we've all forgotten." It wasn't just her children who had started to remember. Over the past year, Rachel had received more letters than she could count. Most weren't formal, just handwritten notes slipped under her door after remembering circles, emails with no subject lines, cards from people who had found her story in a podcast or community newsletter. The content varied: dreams of loved ones, near-death brushes never shared aloud, quiet moments where someone felt seen for the first time. But the heart of every message was the same. "Thank you for reminding me that I'm not alone." And she treasured them. Not as validation, but as evidence of the quiet ripple. A reminder that her yes on the other side had become an open door for others to say yes too. Rachel had become as her guide. Gale once whispered, a walking thin place, a living intersection between the visible and the invisible. She didn't set out to do this. She didn't wake up one day and declare herself a spiritual leader. Instead, she moved through the world with tenderness and integrity, trusting that the garden she once stood in could bloom anywhere if her heart stayed soft and her spirit stayed listening. One of the most beautiful places it bloomed was in the relationships she thought she had lost. Years earlier, before the aneurysm, Rachel had grown apart from her younger sister, Claire. Their differences, political, religious, emotional, had become a slow and silent rift. Phone calls turned to texts. Holidays became obligatory, and eventually distance replaced warmth. But after Rachel's story became known in their extended family, Claire called out of the blue. "I don't know what happened to you," she'd said, voice cracking, "but I think I need it too." That spring, Claire visited Vermont. They sat by the fireplace late into the night, not rehashing the past, but sharing what was present. Vulnerability, forgiveness, and a sense that perhaps both of them had been searching for the same light in different ways. As they hugged goodbye, Claire whispered, "It's like you remembered who you are, and now I'm remembering who I am too." Rachel knew then healing doesn't always look like fixing it, often looks like returning. In the quiet of her own soul, Rachel began seeing the garden in everything. In the slow movement of geese overhead, in the wind that curled around the birch trees near her back deck, in the face of the elderly woman she passed on her morning walks, whose eyes held oceans. The veil was not something torn open once, it was something gently lifted again and again by love. She continued to wake during the thin hours of the night, lighting a candle and sitting in stillness. But now she no longer asked who or what she was praying for. She simply offered herself as a vessel. "Use me," she whispered into the dark. "I'm yours." And somehow, even without names or outcomes, peace would always descend like a mist that covered the earth before sunrise. By midsummer, Rachel had completed a series of 12 paintings she called the Remembrance Sequence. Each one depicted a different scene from her near-death experience, not literal but symbolic: the river of souls, the field of lifetimes, the silent gazebo where choices are made. She didn't plan to sell them. Instead, she donated them to a small hospice center that had recently opened near the edge of town. The director, a soft-spoken woman with steel-gray hair, had tears in her eyes as Rachel unveiled the final piece. "We don't have to explain this," the woman said. "The dying will know." And that was all Rachel needed. As the seasons turned once more, Rachel found herself speaking less but seeing more. The more deeply she listened to the unseen, the more clearly she understood her legacy would never be written in fame or headlines. It would be written in healed hearts, in softened grief, in souls that remembered their eternal name, because she dared to speak hers. She had become what the garden had whispered she would be all along, a living bridge between forgetting and remembering, between fear and peace, between here and home. And one evening, as she sat alone beneath a Vermont sky splashed with stars, a breeze brushed her cheek and she smiled, not because of what she had done, but because she finally understood. She hadn't just come back from the light, she had become part of it. By the time her 70th birthday approached, Rachel Adams no longer measured her life by milestones or years. Time had folded gently around her like a soft quilt stitched with moments of presence rather than pages of calendars. She didn't fear age, nor did she chase youth. Instead, she greeted each morning with the reverence of someone who had been sent back to earth on assignment and had chosen day after day to say yes. Her hair had turned a silvery white now, not unlike the soft light she remembered from the garden. Her hands, once so shaky from recovery, were steady again, delicate but sure. She still painted, still prayed, still hummed during long walks through the forest behind her home. But more than anything, Rachel had become known, not for what she did, but for how she made people feel. When you sat with her, you felt safe. You felt remembered. You felt somehow that you had been known before you even spoke your name. She never built a ministry, never ran a foundation, never trademarked a brand, or published a bestseller. And yet her impact had rippled quietly through hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. Her remembering circles continued in small homes and church basements, sometimes led by those she had mentored, sometimes just carried on by those who had been touched. Her story had passed from mouth to mouth, like a sacred thread. A woman who died, saw eternity, and came back simply to love better. In early autumn, Rachel felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not illness, just a knowing. She had always trusted that kind of knowing. It wasn't dramatic, it was gentle, a softness in the chest, a stirring in her dreams. Her guides, who had grown quieter in recent years, began to appear again in more vivid ways. Gail's presence felt near when she stirred her tea in the morning. Jonah showed up in dreams, standing by doorways that opened into light. And Elia whispered to her, not in sentences, but in waves of joy, deep wordless joy that wrapped around her when she walked through sunlight or placed her hand over her heart. She didn't tell many people. She didn't need to. Rachel had long since made peace with death, not as an end, but as a return. She knew that the choice she had made decades ago to come back had been the right one. She had fulfilled what she was sent to do, to awaken love, to bear witness, and to remind others that heaven was never far. A few weeks later, on the golden October afternoon, Rachel lay in her bed with the window cracked open, letting the breeze carry in the smell of turning leaves. Mark held her hand, his grip still strong after all these years. Her children sat nearby, grown now, gentle with the kind of wisdom that only comes from having walked alongside someone who had truly lived awake. A few close friends gathered, and someone hummed quietly the same soft tune Rachel had once sung to a woman who was grieving. The air felt thin, sacred. Rachel's breathing slowed. Her eyes, still clear as ever, blinked slowly toward the light pouring in through the window. And then, like a leaf slipping from a branch, she let go. Peacefully. Completely. As if she'd simply remembered the way home. But that wasn't the end. Because long after her body was returned to the earth, her light remained. It lingered in the brushstrokes of her paintings, hanging in hospital halls and private bedrooms. It echoed in the voices of those who gathered each month to sit in circles of silence and remembrance. It pulsed gently in the hearts of her children, who now raised their own with the quiet confidence that life is bigger than we see. Her journals, later found by her daughter, were filled not with plans, but with prayers. One entry read, "If I leave this world and only one person feels less alone, then I have done enough." Another, written just weeks before she passed, "Heaven is not far. It's in the way we listen, the way we love, the way we remember who we are and who we've always been." Those words would one day be printed quietly and without fanfare in a small, cloth-bound book called The Bridge Between. Her daughter Emma didn't publish it for money. She gave it away at hospice centers and community libraries. And like Rachel's life itself, the book became a lantern in dark places, lighting the way without demanding attention. In the end, Rachel didn't leave behind monuments. She left behind reminders. Reminders that the veil is thin, that love is eternal. that death is not the end, that quiet people can carry great light, and that sometimes the most powerful mission a soul can have is simply to live with tenderness and to remind others they were never alone. And somewhere in a place beyond language and time, in a garden radiant with golden light, Rachel walks again, barefoot, joyful, whole. This time not because she was sent back, but because she had finished well, and the garden welcomed her home. Long after Rachel Adams took her final breath beneath that golden October sky, long after the candles at her memorial were gently extinguished and the chairs folded away, her light remained, not in marble statues or stained glass windows, not in awards or plaques, but in something far more enduring, in the soft hush before someone speaks a truth they've never shared aloud, in the steady hand of a hospice nurse sitting with the dying at 3 a.m., in the circle of strangers gathered in silence, letting their souls breathe, in the humming of an old tune while folding warm laundry, in a child's first whispered prayer that they are in fact not alone. Rachel was never meant to change the world with noise. She came back to teach us how to listen, how to remember, how to live like heaven is already here, woven into the ordinary, waiting to be noticed. And so her garden did not die with her. It bloomed, quietly, everywhere.